Good morning, everyone. I want to open with an apology. If this sermon feels overly optimistic, it is because I wrote it right after the Duffer and Ishmaelite golf tournament, in which we here at Rockaway handily won again this year, and I was feeling particularly grateful for the sense of community that I have felt amongst the golfers and the curlers, and a real testament to the men here at Rockaway. A caring community. Many times over the past 30 years, especially in connection with the work I've done with others more recently to engage communities in reducing poverty, I've been asked what is the most important thing people can do to make a difference in the world. That's simple, I almost always reply. Bring chicken soup to your neighbor. Really? Is the typical response. I said yes, and then said, but remember, I said the answer is simple, but the act of bringing soup, well, that takes work. How so? They ask. It requires that you know your neighbor. It requires that you know they are not vegetarian and like soup. It requires that you know them well enough and communicate regularly enough to know they are sick. And once you know they are sick, you must feel compelled to want to make this a priority among the many calls of your time and energy. Your neighbor must know you well enough to feel comfortable in receiving your help, and you must have enough of a relationship to know what they prefer when they are sick, whether it is chicken soup, pho, chana masala, or even ice cream. So you see, the work takes place long before you perform the act of bringing soup. I shared for Sunday service with Herb Street Church based on my book Deepening Community, where I read that story from. And one of the most profound moments in those 4 weeks was Jim Herb of Urban Good Funeral Home, now a regional counselor, came up to me and said, Paul, I am dismayed at the inability of churches to do funerals. He said, I've had to expand my business, build more chapels, because funerals just don't have, churches just don't have the capacity to do a funeral. We've recently, Marlene and I, been appointed to lead Team 4, one of our caring community structures here at Rockaway. And we were asked to host a funeral. And neither Marlene or I had done one, and anyone that in our group that had was away that week. And so I said, I'd offer to come and learn, but we need to experience one and all the details that go to it. And we came then a little early that day, and John and Sharon were particularly helpful in addressing this, and others did as well. But it was fascinating to open one's eyes to what goes on behind the scenes in a funeral. As someone that we dearly love has been lost, and many of us are grieving, and some very deeply. So as you enter the parking lot, there are parkers. Sometimes it's raining, and they're there with umbrellas. And often there's more than one. And they're parking the people who are coming in. You come in to the building, and there are greeters and often ushers, if the funeral directors don't do that, but they ushers to help you into the church. And then there's someone at the sound booth, and of course there's the pastor who's been involved with the families all through their grief. When the service is over, the ushers lead people down into the basement, and there is a whole team a big team, that has laid out all the food, that has taken all the cellophane wrap off the food, that has put the plates down, that is waiting anxiously for the group to come and to feed. All of this in expression of love and caring. So I ask, how did we get here? Who are we that we can do this? What makes us a caring community, and what has allowed us to do this 4 times this year already? And that essentially is the search in this talk today. Thomas and I spoke of this, and I went back to my research in which I interviewed 500 people on their experience of community, and it resulted in this book called Deepening Community. First of all, maybe just to talk a little bit about why community, and in some senses, the ability for us to take the time to choose community. And that's kind of an interesting one. I mean, in many ways, we all have community in our lives. The fact that we are here this morning, this is a sense of community. You may go to the park this afternoon and feel this sense of resonance. Many of us will go to a baseball game and do the wave. A tremendous sense of community that has. And there's all these sort of interactions in which community is just part of our lives. Where it changes is that we start to look for more than that. And that requires some sort of a commitment. I think in a church community, that commitment might mean coming to church often, at least more often than I do. But we come and we build relationships, not only on the physical Sunday, but also throughout the other relationships that brings forth. And so, in a sense, community isn't just something that we have, it is also something we choose. And we choose to deepen that experience of community. Community, I think instinctually we know this, but it's good for us. It's not good to be lonely, and community helps us to not be lonely. It does that in so many different ways. Part of it is just the relationships that we have. It fills our time, but it also has the potential to be a caring community in which, when we are feeling particularly disconnected, we can reach out to others to help us. Community makes us healthier. It's interesting. Dr. Dean Ornish, one of the great surgeons in the United States, cardiac surgeon, noticed that when people who came into his clinic after surgery, the ones who had more community in their lives lived healthier and longer. And he did some studies. One of them was to study single mothers and had them fill out a survey. How many of you, if you were to be ill, particularly in a sort of life-threatening way, how many people would you reach out to in the first week? And it was interesting, if it was less than 3, the birth weights were significantly lower than those that had more than 8, which was just a kind of an interesting study. He did the same with a cold. He put a cold on a litmus stick, and people would sniff it. And those who had less than 3 got colds a lot more than those that had more than 8. And one could look at all the biological reasons for that, but in reality, he leveled it to the point that the more connections, the more people in our lives, the better. The Surgeon General in America just released a report this year about the epidemic of loneliness in America, and that has been mirrored here in Canada as well. And it comes with a decline of people being part of institutions like churches. I think in some ways, for me, one of the most important things about being about community is that it makes people happier in so many different ways. A dear colleague, John Halliwell from the University of British Columbia, he is the one who leads the happiness report worldwide every year. And he's this researcher, economist, very straight-faced when he presents. You'll never crack a smile. But at the end of every talk that I've heard him give, he ends like this. There are so many things I can tell you to do to be happy, and there are so many things we have learned about happiness. But if you truly want to be happy, there's only one thing that you need to remember. The more we get together, the more we get together. It's a lovely way to hear him end his talk. So, what did we learn from these 500 people that might be relevant to our congregation as we explore the idea of being a caring community? Well, when we talk to these 500 people, we ask questions like, when did they experience community? So what were the moments? What were the experiences that they had that they did experience community? How often did they experience community? And then we ask the question, what could we each do to experience more community in our lives? There were some really interesting concepts, but at the end we settled on 4 things. I was a bit disappointed in these 4 because I was expecting some profound kind of epiphany, but they were very straightforward and simple. 1 was invest in relationships, hear each other's stories. 2 was have fun together. 3 was work together or learn to care for one another. And 4 was work together for a better world. And that sense of being together. Let me take us through those. So relationships are somewhat obvious. It's sort of being in relationship. But there was a greater sense that it wasn't only about sort of being in relationship, it was also nurturing those relationships, knowing each other's story. We've all heard the saying, you will never fear someone whose story you know. I was a volunteer at the Lifers group in a maximum security penitentiary, so I don't quite agree with that completely. Knowing someone's story does not necessarily not have you fear them, but it's an interesting notion, right, of getting to know each other. I think of the ways that we invest in that here at Rockway as part of what builds a caring community. In a few minutes, we're going to be having coffee, and we're going to have the deliberate opportunity of standing together and having that coffee. In some ways, when we have fun together, it always relates, usually here, to some food, sitting together across from people, getting to know them. Of course, what I love the most about golf and curling is the opportunity to talk to each other. And I've gotten to know people here at this congregation better through that than almost any other activity. And we build friendships. And as we build those relationships, they are the things that start to draw us in. And they are the ones that deepen our experience of community and lead us to other activities. The second one that we found is just this notion of having fun together. And it was interesting what fun does. And it strikes me because so often churches feel that investing in fun isn't a good investment, right? But it's a sense that when we are enjoying each other, sometimes even a little bit competitive. I know in sport we can be very competitive and even, challenge each other. And yet after, we sit around and have a beer and we talk and we chat and we've gotten to know each other better. We've tested boundaries in a fun way. But just that notion of fun seems to open people's hearts. And we just sort of sense and there's a commonness. We leave that fun having had a common experience. So you can right away see, right? We've all had that experience of fun. We've all had fun, different ways, and it means different things to us, but we now have that in common. And so we feel connected to one another. But it's the third one, in a sense, that was the most interesting one, and people felt it was the most challenging. And that's why we said it was learning to care for one another. It wasn't just caring for one another. It wasn't just the spontaneous acts of caring that seemed to matter. It was more about the rituals of caring. You know, Marlene was saying to me after the service last week, where the children and the schools were being affirmed. And she said, you better talk about that one, you know, because it was this sense that we were affirming that moment of the year. But we do it every year. It's a ritual, right? You know, when children reach a certain age, they get a gift. I think it's a quilt or a Bible. Is it the quilt or is it the Bible? Both. There you go, right? You know, you think of the funeral. It's not a simple task. Not to do it once, not to do it 4 times. And you could really see what Jim Erb is saying. Like, at what point are we not going to be wanting to do that anymore? At what point are we not going to be able to do that anymore? And how do we invest as a congregation in ourselves and in our ability to host funerals? And of course, all of us will benefit from that. Just in the sense, like, sorry, I'm diverting here, but a funeral is an interesting topic in some ways because we're all going to have one, whether it's a physical one or not. And in some ways, a beautiful funeral is the ultimate gift that you give to your family and to your friends after you've gone. Because it is this wonderful way, this wonderful time of memory. Not only memory of your life, but the memory of the goodness of life. And what a gift that is that we can present. But there are so many acts of caring that take place in this congregation. There are so many groups of activity, whether they are friendship circles, whether they're walking groups, whether they're book clubs, whether they're curling, whether they're golf, whether they're music, right? But there are these acts that when we get to know one another, we feel this compelling need. And honestly, when I thought of that day, and there we were downstairs, John and Sharon were orienting us, showing us this guide that I think Ellie wrote it. It was just a million little notes. But when you read them, you get a sense of what needs to be done. It wasn't the physical acts in themselves. It was the sense that we were celebrating. In our sadness, we were celebrating our love of this individual who was a part of our community. And we weren't doing this out of obligation, but more so, we were doing this out of love, which is the cornerstone, then, of a caring community. I won't go through the last one, but I'll just tell you what it is. So, know each other's story, build relationships, have fun together, learn to care for one another. And then the fourth one is work together to build a better world. And it was just this sense that when we work together, and we just had a whole group of us meet with the refugee family that we're supporting, and it was so evident there again, that when you are in relationship with one another, making things better for others, you open your hearts to the others that you're helping, but you're also opening your hearts to each other. And so we found this remarkable 98% of the people we interviewed shared about their deepest experience of community is when they were expressing and experiencing collective altruism. In conclusion, I was struck in the book of Acts, and again rereading that story, that the emphasis of the early church was very much their response to their gratefulness to God and to celebrate the memory of Jesus. And so some would suggest that what this was is to build a sense of belonging with one another and to exercise the rituals of community, and that these most define the early church, and in so many ways set them apart from people who were worshiping around them. Rockway, again, this is my optimistic view after a marvelous golf tournament, I would like to propose is doing well. Well, there's obviously things we can adjust. I think we have learned to get to know one another and to be together. We've learned to have fun together, and we have many rituals of caring that hold us well. Investing community, as I shared earlier, is good for us. It does, though, take personal investment, and it requires each of us to be involved, for us to be engaged, for us attending, joining, participating, and contributing. There are so many often and competing calls for our time. Investing in a caring community is time well spent, with benefits in the now and in the end.